Now, the junta-ruled Burkina Faso has become the latest African nation to pass a law banning homosexuality and instituting punishments of up to 5 years in prison.
Have you ever wondered why so many African countries seem to be passing anti-homosexuality laws almost simultaneously? It feels less like independent choices and more like a coordinated wave sweeping across the continent. Take Burkina Faso, for example, once one of the few places where same-sex relations weren't criminalized. It has now reversed course. The transitional parliament recently voted unanimously to outlaw homosexual acts, introducing prison sentences, fines, and even deportation for foreigners. But is this really about protecting family values, or is there a deeper force driving this shift? And how did Burkina Faso move from quiet tolerance to outright criminalization in less than 2 years? Let's dig deeper. Africa's story is often framed in extremes: conflict or progress, tradition or modernity. Yet in reality, its turning points usually come as quiet undercurrents that only become visible once laws begin to reflect them. That's exactly what happened in Burkina Faso. For decades, same-sex relations existed in a kind of legal silence, neither openly accepted nor actively promoted, but simply ignored. This silence was a legacy of history, setting Burkina Faso apart from most of the continent where colonial-era laws had long criminalized homosexuality. When the country gained independence from France in 1960, it avoided inheriting the restrictive penal codes that former British colonies carried forward. No laws against homosexuality were ever written into its system. This absence of legal prohibition placed Burkina Faso among a small group of African nations where courts never addressed the matter. Still, silence was never the same as freedom. Deep-rooted social conservatism shaped by religion and cultural tradition kept homosexuality stigmatized, unspoken in public, and condemned in private. The law may not have punished homosexuality in Burkina Faso, but society rarely tolerated it. Still, the very absence of legal condemnation mattered. It placed the country in a unique position on the African map, where, at least on paper, people could not be imprisoned for their private choices. This did not mean same-sex couples lived openly, but it did mean the state avoided taking an official stance against them. That fragile space of neutrality endured for more than 60 years. Everything began to shift in 2024 when the transitional government under Captain Ibrahim Traoré proposed a draft amendment to the Family Code. For the first time in Burkina Faso's history, homosexuality was explicitly defined as a criminal offense. The announcement was not an isolated act, but part of a broader continental trend. In neighboring Mali, a junta-led government had already imposed a ban. Uganda shocked the world with one of the harshest anti-LGBT laws ever passed, even including the death penalty for so-called aggravated homosexuality. Ghana debated its own restrictive bill, while Nigeria had long enforced its prohibitions. Burkina Faso, once an outlier, was now falling in line with a growing wave across Africa. This alignment became official in September 2025, when Burkina Faso's parliament voted unanimously to criminalize homosexual acts. The law imposed sentences of 2 to 5 years in prison, financial penalties, and deportation for foreigners. Justice Minister at Assa Rodrigue Baya defended the legislation as a measure to protect society from bizarre behavior, a sentiment that resonated deeply in a nation where more than 90% of citizens identify with a religion. Overnight, what had once been tolerated in silence became punishable by law. This reversal cannot be dismissed as mere legal housekeeping. It carries a deeper significance. Burkina Faso has chosen to articulate openly what was once left unsaid. Silence has been replaced with a firm position, one that reflects the convictions of its society rather than the liberal frameworks promoted by the global order. To its leaders, this was not about inventing new morality, but about affirming values long embedded in cultural and religious life. Yet this decision raises a far larger question, one that extends well beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Africa is increasingly asserting its own voice in matters of law and morality, pushing back against outside influence and reclaiming independence. But with that independence comes inevitable friction. Institutions like the United Nations and the World Bank evaluate nations through human rights benchmarks that often clash with local traditions. This leaves Burkina Faso facing a dilemma greater than legislation itself. How can a nation assert cultural sovereignty without risking isolation or punishment from a world that demands conformity to external values? History shows that African nations rarely move alone. A legal shift in one capital often reverberates across the continent, not out of blind imitation, but because of shared struggles and conditions. Burkina Faso's new law fits this continental pattern, a wider push to reassert control over morality, culture, and law, even in defiance of Western criticism. Across the region, governments have been debating, strengthening, or enforcing anti-LGBT measures. Uganda, Nigeria, Ghana, and Mali are among the most visible examples, but they are not exceptions. They are part of a rising trend. What unites them is not only religious conservatism or cultural tradition, but also something deeper: the perception that African values are constantly judged, reshaped, or imposed by external powers. When Western governments or global institutions tie aid, loans, or trade to the adoption of liberal policies, many Africans interpret it not as progress, but as interference. Thus, the debate shifts from sexuality to sovereignty. In Burkina Faso, this sense of sovereignty carries particular weight. Under Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the nation has presented itself as a key player in a new Sahelian awakening, breaking ties with colonial powers, expelling French troops, and forging closer alliances with neighbors like Mali and Niger. Sovereignty has become its rallying cry. Against this backdrop, the criminalization of homosexuality cannot be separated from a broader political project. It is not only a legal amendment, it is a declaration. We, not outsiders, decide what governs our land. This sentiment resonates deeply across African societies. In villages and towns, in mosques and churches, in family gatherings and community councils, identity and morality are not abstract concepts, but lived realities. For many Africans, law is not an external imposition, it is an extension of culture itself. In Burkina Faso, laws are expected to reflect the moral foundation of society. So when leaders criminalize homosexuality, they are not simply legislating, they are aligning themselves with the collective understanding of how culture should be preserved. In a nation where nearly every citizen belongs to a faith community, this alignment carries powerful social legitimacy. The unanimous vote in Parliament came as no surprise. It was less a political decision than a reflection of a shared worldview. Yet this is where the dilemma begins, because Africa does not exist in isolation. It trades, it negotiates, it seeks investment, and it depends on global networks. The same international institutions that condemned Uganda or withheld loans over anti-LGBT laws are also active in Burkina Faso. Rights groups have already sounded the alarm, warning of possible consequences. The risk is clear. By affirming sovereignty, Burkina Faso could invite financial and diplomatic penalties at a time when insecurity and economic hardship already weigh heavily on the nation. Such penalties could cut deep, but this is also where Africa's response is taking shape. More and more, African nations are turning away from dependence on Western aid and seeking partnerships with one another or with non-Western powers. Burkina Faso's growing ties with Mali, Niger, Russia, and China are not just about economic or military cooperation, they are about creating political breathing space. Space to make decisions without the immediate fear of punishment from Washington, London, or Brussels. These new alliances act as a kind of shield, allowing governments to prioritize their own values, even when those values clash with Western expectations. Seen in this light, Burkina Faso's law is not only about homosexuality, it is about Africa's trajectory. It signals a shift toward governance rooted in cultural sovereignty, even at the cost of international friction. Whether this project succeeds will depend on the strength of these alliances and the resilience of African economies against potential sanctions. The path forward is risky, but it reflects a deeper truth. Africa is no longer willing to remain silent or compliant on matters of culture. It seeks to speak in its own voice even when the world disagrees. This raises a pressing question. If sovereignty is the solution, how can African nations balance cultural independence with the material pressures of global politics? Before we continue, a quick thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting this channel, you're becoming part of a cultural movement. Now, let's return to the story. Laws are never just ink on paper. They are mirrors reflecting what people believe, what they fear, and what leaders want to project. In Burkina Faso, the decision to criminalize homosexuality cannot be understood solely as a copy of Uganda's or Mali's policies. It is part of a distinctly Burkina story. The first layer of that story is religion. In this country, faith runs deep, shaping not only private devotion, but also the rhythm of daily life. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.